At Victor Harland's funeral, his grieving widow, Clara, thought she was about to say goodbye with dignity. Instead, her son Elias thanked another woman, Serena Vale, and the lawyer announced that the mistress would inherit everything. Betrayed by her own family, Clara uncovered a trail of lies stretching back decades, hidden letters, secret villas, and even proof of stolen fortunes. When she confronted her son, he defended Serena, leaving Clara isolated and heartbroken. But Clara was not done. With the help of an old friend, she uncovered shocking evidence of fraud and took Serena to court, revealing a secret will that no one expected. What happened next destroyed the mistress's empire and changed Clara's life forever. If you enjoy stories filled with betrayal secrets and shocking twists, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. Now let me take you back to that stormy day when the Harland family's darkest secrets began to unravel. The storm had gathered over the coastal town long before the funeral began. Heavy clouds rolled in from the sea, pressing low over the cathedral's spire, and the wind carried the smell of salt and rain through the narrow streets. Inside the stone cathedral, candles flickered in tall brass holders, their flames shivering every time the old wooden doors creaked open. The place felt ancient and solemn, filled with echoes of footsteps and hushed whispers as mourners found their seats. Clara Harland sat in the second row from the back, her black veil drawn carefully across her face. She had chosen her seat deliberately, not at the front where the family of the deceased usually sat, but where shadows softened her presence. 40 years as Victor Harland's wife, and yet she felt like a stranger at his farewell. The air around her was cold, her gloved hands clasped tightly in her lap. She stared at the coffin draped in velvet and wondered how a man could take so much of her life and still leave her with nothing but silence. The organ began its low lament, and the crowd rose as Elias, her son, walked down the aisle. He cut a striking figure, tall and composed in a tailored black suit, his posture as rigid as his father's had once been. Clara's heart swelled with a brief, fragile pride. Elias was all she had left now, the one thread tying her to a life that had suddenly unraveled. She thought perhaps he would say the words that might restore her dignity. Perhaps he would acknowledge her place beside his father, her years of quiet devotion, her sacrifices that had gone unseen. He stepped up to the podium, adjusted the microphone, and for a moment his voice trembled as he began to speak. He spoke of Victor Harland's accomplishments, of his brilliance in business, of his generosity in public life. Clara listened, each word cutting deeper, as she realized none of it belonged to the man she had known behind closed doors. But she waited, holding her breath, certain that when the time came he would turn to her and give her the recognition she had long been denied. Instead, he paused and lifted his gaze to the crowd. His tone softened and he said, "There is someone here who deserves more thanks than anyone else. Someone who stood by my father through every trial, who gave him strength when he needed it most. Serena Vale." A murmur spread through the pews like ripples across a pond. All heads turned toward the front row where a woman in a dark emerald dress sat composed and radiant. Serena Vale. She rose gracefully, dabbing her eyes with a silk handkerchief, then gave a small nod of acknowledgement, as though she had been waiting for this very moment. Her posture was perfect, her expression delicate with sorrow, her beauty refined by confidence. Clara's breath caught. The name struck her like a blade. Serena Vale had once been nothing more than Victor's business associate, a woman Clara had dismissed as another face in the crowded gatherings of corporate dinners. But here she was seated at the front, claimed as family, receiving gratitude from the very son Clara had raised. Clara gripped her veil tighter, her knuckles whitening. She felt the world around her blur, as if the cathedral itself were tilting. Memories came rushing back, late nights, when Victor had claimed to be working unexplained trips, the distance that had grown between them like cracks in old stone. For years she had told herself not to be suspicious, not to question that a wife's strength was in her patience. Now the truth was displayed before her, brazen and undeniable. When the eulogies ended, Clara rose slowly with the others, her body heavy as stone. Guests lined up to offer condolences, though most gravitated towards Serena, touching her hand, murmuring words of comfort. Clara stood aside, forgotten in the dim light of the aisle. Then, as she turned to leave, she caught sight of something that froze her in place. Elias had stepped down from the podium, walked straight to Serena, and embraced her. Clara watched his lips move, barely catching the words, but they were sharp enough to slice through her heart. "You are the one who was truly family," he whispered. Serena smiled faintly, pressing a hand to his cheek with the ease of a mother soothing her child. Clara's vision swam. She nearly stumbled as she turned away, her heart hammering so loud she could hardly hear the echo of footsteps around her. Outside, the storm had broken. Rain pelted the cathedral steps and thunder rolled over the sea. Clara pulled her coat tight and walked into the downpour, letting the cold water wash over her face. It masked her tears, though nothing could mask the wound carved inside her. She had been erased, not just by her husband's betrayal, but by her son's choice. The life she had built was not only gone, it had been rewritten without her. That night, the Harland estate stood silent. The grand halls echoed with emptiness, the portraits on the walls staring down at Clara with cold, unblinking eyes. She lit no lamps, letting the darkness settle around her as she sat alone in the study. On the desk lay a folded program from the funeral, Victor's name embossed in gold letters. She traced it with her finger and felt nothing but bitterness. She thought of Elias again, the way his voice had carried such warmth when speaking to Serena. He had not spared even a glance for her. In that moment, Clara understood that the funeral had not been a farewell for her husband alone. It had been the burial of her place in the Harland family. But beneath the despair, something else stirred, a flicker of anger, sharp and undeniable. She remembered Serena's poised smile, her flawless act of sorrow, the way she basked in the attention of the crowd. There was something too perfect about it, too rehearsed. Clara had lived long enough with Victor to recognize a performance when she saw one. As the storm rattled the windows, Clara leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes. Betrayal had shattered her, yes, but it had also awakened her. She was not done, not yet. There were secrets buried deeper than what had been revealed at the cathedral, and she intended to unearth them. The house groaned in the wind as though echoing her resolve. She stood, walked to the mantel, and picked up a photograph framed in silver. It showed her and Victor in the early years of their marriage, smiling stiffly at a company gala. Clara stared at his younger face, trying to reconcile it with the man who had orchestrated this deception. She set the photograph down, her lips tightening. Somewhere in the shadows of his life there were answers. She had given up her own ambitions to build his legacy, and now she would take back the truth he had stolen from her. The storm outside grew louder, lightning splitting the sky and casting momentary flashes across the walls. Clara whispered into the silence, her voice steady for the first time that day. "You thought you buried me, Victor, but this is where I begin." And with that vow, she turned away from the coffin in her memory and toward the locked rooms of the past, ready to uncover what had been hidden. The next morning, as dawn broke pale and gray over the sea, Clara would make her first discovery, but before she did, she would confront the emptiness of her marriage and the lies she had lived beside for 40 years. The storm faded by dawn, leaving the Harland estate shrouded in damp mist. Clara awoke to the silence of the house, a silence that seemed to press on her chest with every breath. She walked through the long corridors, her footsteps muffled on the worn carpets, past portraits of Victor, in his youth painted with that same unyielding confidence that had always defined him. For the first time, Clara did not feel like the lady of the house. She felt like a guest wandering through someone else's life. In the kitchen, she boiled water for tea, though she did not drink it. The steam rose in thin curls before vanishing into the air, much like her marriage had dissolved into shadows and secrets. As she stood there, she could not help but think of the years that had passed, the years she had surrendered without protest. Clara had once been a historian passionate about unearthing stories buried in archives, piecing together fragments of forgotten lives. She had been sharp, ambitious, and certain of her future. Then came Victor Harland, charming and relentless. He had courted her with promises of stability, of a grand home, of a life where she would never want for anything. She had believed him. More than that, she had believed in him. When Elias was born, she had considered returning to her work. She remembered sitting in her office at the university, holding her infant son in her arms, the smell of old books surrounding her. She had imagined raising him in a world of ideas and knowledge, but Victor had dismissed the thought with a wave of his hand. "I can take care of everything, Clara. You should focus on the home. That is where you belong." And so she did. She left her career behind, telling herself it was a sacrifice made for love for family. She turned her sharp mind to running the estate, managing the staff, organizing events, and smoothing over Victor's frequent tempers. When he grew distant, she told herself it was stress. When he stayed late at the office, she told herself it was duty. When he came home with faint perfume clinging to his suits, she told herself it was nothing. Now, standing alone in the kitchen, she realized those were not sacrifices, they were erasures. Piece by piece, she had allowed her own identity to be erased until she was nothing but the shadow at Victor's side. She walked into the dining room where the long table stretched under a heavy chandelier. She could almost see the ghost of her younger self at the far end waiting patiently as Victor spoke of his latest business triumphs. She could almost hear the silence that followed whenever she tried to speak of her own interests, the way he dismissed her words as trivial. She had thought she was preserving peace. In truth, she had been silencing herself. Her gaze shifted to the chair at the head of the table, Victor's chair. It still held the indentation of his presence, as though even in death he commanded the room. She reached out and touched the armrest, cold and smooth beneath her fingers. All those years, she had brought him his meals, tended to his comforts, while he built another world beyond her sight. The memories came in a torrent. Nights when she stayed awake with Elias as he struggled through fevers while Victor slept undisturbed in the next room. Days when she balanced the household accounts, stretching every coin to cover expenses, while Victor spent lavishly on his ventures. She had even sold her mother's heirloom brooch to pay for Elias's schooling, telling herself Victor would repay her sacrifice with gratitude. Instead, he had repaid her with secrets. Clara's chest tightened as she recalled the time she had sensed something was wrong. A whisper at a company party, a fleeting glance between Victor and Serena. She remembered Serena approaching her once with a glass of wine, smiling, with that polished charm, asking questions that seemed too pointed, too personal. Clara had dismissed it then as paranoia, but now she understood. Serena had been weaving her way into their lives for years, and Clara had been blind. The weight of it all pressed down on her until she sank into a chair at the dining table. The house around her felt like a stage set, its walls built on illusions, its rooms filled with ghosts. She had spent 4 decades maintaining a marriage that was nothing more than a performance. Yet as the despair threatened to pull her under, another thought began to rise. If her marriage had been a lie, then what had she been preserving all these years? If Victor had given his true life to another woman, then what remained for Clara to lose? The answer struck her with startling clarity. Nothing. That realization did not weaken her. It freed her. She no longer had to cling to appearances, to silence, to the false image of loyalty. She could search for the truth without fear, because the worst had already been done to her. Her husband was gone. Her son had chosen another woman. Her marriage was a ruin. What remained was her strength. Clara stood and walked to the window. The morning fog was lifting over the cliffs, revealing the restless sea beyond. She pressed her hand to the cold glass, watching the waves crash against the rocks. It was violent, merciless, but also alive. Perhaps she had been too still for too long. Perhaps it was time to become like the sea. Behind her, the grandfather clock chimed its sound, echoing through the empty halls. Clara turned back to the dining room, her eyes narrowing on Victor's chair. For years it had been a symbol of his authority, but now it was nothing more than an empty seat. She realized she had been sitting in the wrong place all her life. She walked to the head of the table and lowered herself into the chair. The leather creaked beneath her, and for a moment she felt the weight of Victor's ghost pressing down. But she did not move. She sat taller, folding her hands on the polished wood, as though claiming her rightful place at last. A quiet determination settled over her. She would not fade into the background. She would not let Serena Vale or anyone else write her out of her own story. Somewhere in Victor's carefully constructed world there were cracks, and through those cracks she would find the truth. The storm outside had passed, but Clara knew another was coming, one of her own making. She was no longer the obedient wife who accepted silence as love. She was the historian again, ready to dig into the past, ready to uncover what had been buried. And she would begin with the question that lingered like a shadow in her mind. How long had Victor's lies stretched back, and how much of her life had been stolen for another woman's gain? The thought sent a chill through her, but it also sharpened her resolve. The answers were out there, hidden in letters and records, in memories others had chosen to ignore, and Clara Harland would find them. The following week brought Clara to a building she had entered only a handful of times in her life. The law offices of Morton and Clark stood at the corner of the old financial district, a tall structure of red brick and iron that had weathered more than a century of storms. Its narrow windows reflected the pale light of morning, and the air smelled faintly of ink leather and dust when Clara stepped inside. She followed a secretary down a long corridor lined with shelves of law books. Each step echoed against the tiled floor, magnifying her unease. She had convinced herself that perhaps despite everything, Victor had not meant to erase her. Surely there would be provisions for her in his will. After 4 decades of marriage, after raising Elias and tending the Harland estate, there had to be some acknowledgement. The secretary ushered her into a small room paneled in dark wood. At the center sat a polished table where the family was meant to gather. But Clara saw only 3 chairs occupied. At the head was Mr. Clark, an aging lawyer with a voice as heavy as his presence. Beside him sat Elias, his posture straight, his eyes fixed ahead, and directly across from Elias was Serena Vale. She looked as though she belonged there, poised in a tailored suit of deep green, her hair drawn back with elegant precision. A pearl brooch glittered at her collar, catching the thin light that seeped through the blinds. She greeted Clara with a small, knowing smile that chilled her more than the damp air of the morning. Clara lowered herself into the remaining chair. Her heart thudded as the lawyer adjusted his glasses and opened a folder thick with documents. His voice was measured, deliberate, every syllable pressed into the silence of the room. Pursuant to the last will and testament of Victor Harland, he began the estate properties and liquid assets are to be transferred in full to Miss Serena Vale. The words crashed over Clara like a wave breaking against stone. For a moment she could not move, could not breathe. She clutched the edge of the table, her gloves creasing under the strain. All holdings, the lawyer continued, including the Harland estate, the vineyard properties, and the accounts, both foreign and domestic, are to be inherited solely by Miss Vale. There are no provisions for alternative beneficiaries. Clara's gaze snapped to Elias. She expected disbelief, outrage, some spark of loyalty. But her son sat rigid, his fingers perfectly interlocked on the table. His expression was calm, as though he had rehearsed this moment long before it arrived. "You knew," Clara whispered, her voice trembling. Elias did not flinch. Father had his reasons. Reasons. Her voice cracked. What did 40 years of marriage mean to him? "What did I mean?" Elias turned to her, then his tone disturbingly serene. "He said you were devoted, yes. But he also said you did not understand him. Serena did. She respected him. She made him happy." The words fell like stones in Clara's chest. She saw not only the betrayal of her husband, but the slow erosion of her son's love. She had lost Victor to another woman in life, and now in death she was losing Elias as well. Serena folded her hands in her lap, her smile polite but triumphant. She did not need to speak. The weight of her victory radiated through the room. The lawyer closed the folder with a heavy thud. "This concludes the reading of the will." Clara rose from her chair on unsteady legs. Her handbag felt like lead on her arm. She turned without a word and walked out into the corridor. The sound of the door clicking shut behind her echoed in her ears like the closing of a vault. Outside, the streets bustled with ordinary life. Carts rattled over cobblestones, clerks hurried past with papers tucked under their arms, and the air smelled faintly of roasted chestnuts from a vendor on the corner. But Clara felt as though she had stepped into a different world altogether, one where she no longer existed. She made her way back to the Harland estate in silence. The drive seemed endless, each mile stretching the weight of betrayal deeper into her bones. When at last she reached the house, she stood in the driveway for what felt like hours, staring at the looming facade. It was no longer her home. It was a stage built for a life she had never truly lived. Inside, she wandered through the rooms like a stranger. In Victor's study, his scent still lingered in the wool coats hanging neatly in the closet. His desk was arranged with the precision he demanded of everything. She opened a drawer and found old receipts notes scrawled in his sharp handwriting, even letters addressed not to her but to Serena. Her hands shook as she unfolded one of them. It was a letter from a property manager along the coast, addressed to Serena detailing renovations on a villa. The date was 6 years earlier. Clara had been at that villa many times, believing it was part of Victor's business holdings. She realized now she had been a guest in Serena's home, blind to the truth that had been before her eyes. The betrayal reached further back than she dared to admit. Every memory she examined cracked and crumbled under scrutiny. The anniversaries spent alone, the unexplained absences, the nights Victor claimed to be traveling for work. All of it had been for Serena. Clara sank into Victor's armchair, the leather cold beneath her. She pressed her palm against her forehead, trying to steady the storm inside her. She had lost everything: her husband's respect, her son's loyalty, and now the life she had spent decades building. Yet in that silence, as the house loomed around her, another thought crept into her mind. Victor had been careful, meticulous, but even the most careful man leaves traces. If Serena had inherited everything, it meant Victor had arranged it deliberately. But why? What did he owe her that outweighed a lifetime with Clara? The question burned in her chest. Somewhere in the shadows of Victor's affairs lay an answer, and Clara would find it. She would not accept erasure. She would not allow her story to end in silence. As the evening sun sank behind the cliffs, casting the estate in long shadows, Clara rose from the chair. She looked once more at the drawer of letters, then closed it with a decisive snap. If Victor had chosen to build another life in secret, then she would uncover every corner of it, and when she did, she would not only reveal the truth, she would reclaim the dignity that had been stolen from her. The storm outside had passed, but in Clara's heart another was rising. The nights that followed the reading of the will were sleepless for Clara. She wandered the halls of the estate like a ghost, unable to escape the sense that she was walking through a museum of lies. The portraits of Victor stared down from the walls, his eyes painted with pride and authority, and she found herself questioning how much of her life with him had been real. On the third night, she descended into the study again. The air smelled faintly of leather and dust, the scent of old books lining the shelves. She opened drawer after drawer of Victor's desk, her hands trembling, driven by a desperation that overpowered her grief. Somewhere she thought there had to be a thread to pull, something that would unravel the web of deceit Serena had woven into their lives. At the bottom of a file cabinet, she found a folder pressed between old tax records. Inside were letters, their edges yellowed, the ink faded but still legible. The first was addressed to Serena Vale, written in Victor's distinct, sharp hand. The date was more than 15 years ago. Clara read the words with mounting dread. Victor had promised Serena that one day everything would be theirs. He had written of a villa by the cliffs, a place where they could escape, where she would be more than just a shadow. Clara's stomach tightened. She remembered that villa well. Victor had taken her there several times, always claiming it was for business retreats. She had decorated its rooms with fresh flowers, prepared meals in its kitchen, believing she was the lady of that house. Now she realized she had been nothing but a guest in Serena's sanctuary. Shaken, Clara closed the folder and carried it upstairs. She sat at her dressing table, staring at her reflection in the mirror. The woman who stared back was older, lined with years of sacrifice, yet her eyes burned with a clarity she had not seen in decades. The next morning, Clara visited Jacinda Holloway, her longtime neighbor. Jacinda was a widow in her 70s, sharp-eyed and sharper-tongued, with a memory that seemed to hold every detail of the street's history. She welcomed Clara into her sunroom, where the scent of roses filled the air and sunlight streamed through lace curtains. Jacinda, Clara began, her voice unsteady. "Do you remember Serena Vale?" The older woman's expression hardened at the name. "Of course I remember. Wasn't she the one Victor used to take to the symphony, always dressed like she owned the world?" Clara's throat tightened. "He told me he went to those concerts alone. I never liked them." Jacinda shook her head. "I always thought you knew. She was around here often, Clara. Once she even helped Victor put up the Christmas lights. I assumed she was a relative, maybe a cousin. But no, the way he looked at her, I should have realized sooner." Clara's mind raced. That Christmas she had been upstairs with an injured knee, watching from the window as Victor strung the lights. He had told her a neighborhood boy had helped him. She had believed him without question. Now the memory twisted inside her like a knife. "How long?" Clara whispered. Jacinda pursed her lips, thinking, "At least 10, maybe 15 years. I first noticed her around the time you were away caring for your sister. I thought she was filling in to keep him company. I see now that she was replacing you." The words struck Clara like a final blow. 15 years. Half of her marriage had been shared with another woman, and she had been too blind or too trusting to see it. Later that afternoon, Clara returned home with a heaviness that made every step difficult. She went down into the basement, searching through old boxes stacked high against the walls. At the bottom of one, she found a collection of photographs stiff with age. She pulled them out, her hands trembling. One image showed Victor standing beside Serena at a company event, his hand resting lightly on her arm. His smile was radiant, brighter than Clara had ever seen directed at her. Another photo revealed Elias, barely 19, standing with them. His expression was nervous but not reluctant. On the back of the photo, Clara discovered faint writing in Victor's hand. "Our real family. One day." The words blurred as tears filled her eyes. She pressed the photo to her chest, but instead of warmth, she felt only the chill of betrayal. She had not only lost her husband, she had lost her son long before she realized it. Elias had been part of Victor and Serena's secret world, shaped by their influence, drifting farther from her with each passing year. That evening, Clara lit a single candle in the kitchen and sat at the table in silence. She poured herself a glass of water but did not drink. Her thoughts were a storm. She had given up her career, her independence, her voice, all for a marriage that had been hollow for nearly half its duration. She had managed the household, balanced the accounts, and even sold her mother's heirloom ring to pay Elias's tuition, believing she was holding her family together. All the while, Victor had been building a golden future for Serena. The candle burned low, its flame shrinking until it flickered out. Darkness filled the kitchen, but Clara did not move. She understood now that her sacrifices had been wasted on a man who had never truly chosen her. She had been written out of her own life story. Yet in the midst of that despair, she felt a shift deep within. The historian in her stirred the woman who once unearthed hidden truths from forgotten records. Perhaps her life with Victor had been built on lies, but lies left evidence. Secrets left trails. And if she could follow those trails, she could uncover the full scope of what Victor and Serena had done. Clara pushed back from the table, her chair scraping against the floor. She would no longer sit quietly in the shadows. She would investigate every letter, every receipt, every whisper of the past until the truth stood bare before her. Outside, the wind rose again, rattling the shutters. Clara looked out into the night, her reflection faint in the glass, and whispered to herself, "You thought you could erase me, Victor, but you left too many traces." She turned away from the window, her mind sharpened with purpose. Tomorrow she would begin. She would sift through the remnants of his empire, through the documents he thought no one would ever question. And when she was finished, Serena Vale would not be the rightful heir to the Harland fortune. The storm that had once consumed Clara with grief was gone. In its place burned a fire of resolve, and she knew it would carry her into the next battle, the fight for justice and the revelation of every secret Victor had tried to bury. The morning after Clara's discovery, the estate felt colder than usual. She had spent half the night sitting at her desk, staring at the photograph of Victor, Serena, and Elias, the words, "Our real family," still echoing in her mind. Sleep had not come, only the dull ache of betrayal pressing down on her chest. Yet with the rising sun, she resolved to confront the living, not the dead. If Victor's ghost haunted her, Elias's distance wounded her more deeply. She arranged to meet him at a cafe in town, one they had often visited when he was a child. She remembered the way his eyes used to light up whenever he ordered his favorite caramel pastry, how he would press his small hands against the glass counter and point eagerly. Those memories, fragile and precious, gave her courage as she dressed in a plain wool coat and set out for the meeting. The cafe smelled of roasted coffee and cinnamon when she entered, but the warmth did not reach her. Elias was already there, seated at a corner table near the window. He wore a dark trench coat, his hair neatly combed, his posture rigid. He did not rise to greet her. Instead, he gestured to the chair across from him as though she were an acquaintance rather than his mother. Clara sat, her hands folded in her lap. For a moment, silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. Then Elias spoke, his tone clipped and formal. "Why did you send a notice to Serena?" he asked. "Do you realize how uncomfortable this makes everything?" Clara's heart tightened. "Uncomfortable, Elias. Your father deceived me for decades. He built a life with another woman while I gave up everything for this family. And you expect me to stay silent?" Elias's jaw clenched, his gaze hard. "Father loved Serena. He told me so. He said the happiest years of his life were with her. She understood him, respected him, didn't question him the way you always did." Clara's breath caught. The words cut deeper than any blade. "Questioned him. I defended him, Elias. I protected this family when the company nearly collapsed. I stayed by his side when he grew cold and distant. I sacrificed my career, my friends, even my mother's heirloom ring to pay for your education. Do you remember that ring? It was the last gift she gave me before she died. I sold it for you." Elias's expression did not soften. He exhaled sharply as if her words irritated him. "You always bring that up as though I owe you something for it. I didn't ask you to make those sacrifices." Clara's chest ached, not with anger but with a sorrow so deep it threatened to swallow her whole. She looked at him and no longer saw the boy she had raised. Instead, she saw a man sculpted by his father's lies and Serena's quiet influence. "You were my son," she whispered. "You still are. But can you not see what they have done to you, to us?" Elias shook his head, his eyes cold. "You are too traditional, Mother. You think sacrifice is love, but Father didn't need sacrifice. He needed someone who made him feel alive." That was Serena. The words reverberated in her ears. Too traditional, too strong. That was how he saw her. Not as the woman who had sat beside his bed through fevered nights, or the mother who had defended him from cruel classmates, or the only one who stayed by his side when heartbreak crushed him as a teenager. All those moments seemed to vanish from his memory, erased by the glow of Serena's carefully constructed charm. Clara reached into her handbag and pulled out an old photograph faded with age. She slid it across the table toward him. In it, Elias was a toddler on the beach, clutching her neck tightly as the waves rolled near his feet. His father was absent, having chosen work over family yet again. "Do you remember this day?" Clara asked softly. "You were terrified of the waves. You screamed for me, clung to me because you knew I would protect you. Your father wasn't there. He rarely was. It was me, Elias, always me." He looked down at the photograph but said nothing. His expression did not change, though a flicker of hesitation passed through his eyes. Clara clung to that flicker, desperate for any sign of the boy she once knew. "You idolize your father," she continued, her voice steady, though her hands trembled. "You think he was strong, elegant, untouchable. But have you ever wondered why he seemed that way? It was because I carried the burdens he never acknowledged. I built the foundation for him to stand tall. Without me, that illusion would have crumbled long ago." Elias lifted his gaze at last, his eyes sharp but unreadable. "Perhaps, but Father chose Serena. He was happiest with her. You were too strong, Mother. Too strong for him, too strong for me." The finality in his words struck her harder than any storm. Too strong, that was what her devotion had been reduced to. The nights spent nursing him through illness, the sacrifices she had made without hesitation, the love she had poured into both her husband and her son, all dismissed as strength that had no value. Clara felt something shift inside her, then not breaking but hardening. She rose from her chair slowly, her voice calm though her heart ached. "You are right, Elias. I was too strong. And I will no longer waste that strength on people who cannot see it. From this day forward, I will keep it for myself." She left the cafe without looking back, the photograph still lying on the table between them. Outside, the sky was gray and a fine drizzle misted the cobblestones. Clara walked steadily, her footsteps echoing like a quiet drumbeat of resolve. She did not cry. She did not stumble. She simply understood that what she had lost was not only a husband, or even a son. She had lost the illusion that sacrifice guaranteed love, that devotion could not be betrayed. And with that understanding came clarity. If Victor had stolen her marriage and Serena had stolen her place, she would not allow them to steal the truth. Somewhere in the records of his empire lay the evidence of everything he had hidden. If Elias would not believe her now, then one day he would. She would make certain of it. The drizzle thickened into rain as Clara reached her car. She paused for a moment, watching the drops blur the world through the windshield. The rhythm of the storm was steady, relentless, like her own determination. She placed her hands on the steering wheel and whispered to herself, "This is only the beginning." And with that vow, she drove back toward the estate, toward the shadows of Victor's empire, ready to dig deeper than ever before. The rain had eased by the time Clara reached the estate, but the storm inside her had only grown. Elias's words lingered like a cruel echo. Too strong. That was the legacy her son had chosen for her. Yet as the car rolled up the long drive, her sorrow began to shift into something sharper. Strength, yes, she thought. Then let it be strength that uncovers the truth they tried to bury. She went straight to Victor's study, ignoring the gloom of the house around her. The desk, so perfectly ordered, waited like a puzzle yet to be solved. She opened drawers, rifled through ledgers, traced her fingers over neat columns of numbers that had once meant nothing to her. Now they might be the very threads that unraveled Victor's double life. But Victor had always been careful. Too careful. The documents in plain sight revealed nothing unusual. Business accounts, investment statements, tax filings, all proper, all polished. Clara leaned back in the leather chair, her eyes scanning the room. He would not have left his secrets here in the open. He would have hidden them where only someone who knew how to look would find them. She rose and walked to the shelves. Dozens of books lined the walls, many of them untouched for years. She tugged at the spines one by one until her fingers stopped at a volume that felt wrong, too light. She pulled it free and found it hollowed out inside. Within was a small notebook bound in black leather. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside were names of companies she did not recognize, dates and numbers that stretched into the tens of thousands. Each entry was written in Victor's tight script, precise and deliberate. But as she read, her pulse quickened. The names repeated with regularity, as though funds were being cycled through the same channels. Quinton Holdings, Harrow Consulting, Vale Enterprises. Her eyes froze on the last name. Vale. Serena's name. The pages revealed a pattern. Money funneled quietly disguised as consulting fees or project support, all leading back to accounts linked to Serena. The sums were staggering, not just thousands but hundreds of thousands over the course of years. Clara pressed her hand to her chest, struggling to breathe. This was no simple affair. Victor had not only betrayed her with another woman, he had stolen from his own empire, diverted wealth that should have been theirs to build Serena's fortune in the shadows. Her first thought was to storm into Elias's apartment and show him the notebook, force him to see that his father's legacy was nothing but theft and deceit. But then she stopped herself. Elias would not believe her. Not yet. His loyalty to Serena was too deeply ingrained. If she presented evidence now, he would dismiss it as bitterness, as desperation. No. She needed more. Proof so undeniable it could not be ignored. Clara slipped the notebook into her handbag and left the study. The next morning she called Helena Cross, an old friend she had not spoken to in years. Helena had once been a brilliant forensic accountant, a woman who could unravel financial webs with a glance. Clara still remembered the fire in her eyes, the confidence with which she dissected numbers and exposed truths others tried to hide. When Helena answered the phone, her voice was warm but wary. "Clara, my goodness, it has been too long. What is it you need? I need you to help me find something," Clara said. Her voice was calm, steady. "I believe Victor used company funds to support Serena. I need proof." There was a long pause. Then Helena spoke, her tone sharpened with interest. "That is not just betrayal, Clara. That is fraud. Do you know what you are stepping into?" Clara closed her eyes. "I know, and I do not care. I have lived too long in the dark. I need the truth." 2 days later, Clara arrived at Helena's modest house in the suburbs. The living room was filled with files, charts, and a glowing laptop. Helena greeted her with a tight hug, then motioned for her to sit. "I pulled what I could from the archives," Helena said, her fingers flying across the keyboard. "Some of Victor's transactions looked ordinary at first, but once I followed the patterns it became clear. Quinton Holdings, Harrow Consulting, both are shells. No offices, no employees. just empty names used to funnel money. And here she pointed to the screen payments tied directly to Veil Enterprises. That is Serena's registered company. And look at the amounts. Clara leaned closer. 3 transfers glowed on the screen, each timed just outside the company's official audits. 50,000 here, 100,000 there, another 200,000 not long after, more than $350,000 over 5 years hidden in plain sight. Her stomach twisted. She thought of the nights she had counted every penny stretching their household budget. She thought of the sacrifices she had made, the heirlooms she had sold, the silence she had endured. All the while, Victor had been siphoning fortunes into Serena's hands. Helena sat back, folding her arms. This is damning, Clara. Unless Serena can produce invoices proving services of equivalent value, these are fraudulent gifts. If you want to pursue this, you will not just be fighting for dignity, you will be exposing a crime. Clara stared at the screen, her reflection faint in its glow. For years she had buried her suspicions, silenced her doubts. But here it was undeniable, proof that Victor had built Serena's world on stolen wealth. I want to pursue it, Clara said. Her voice was firm, steady as stone. Every last penny he gave her, I want it exposed. Helena studied her for a long moment, then nodded. Then you will need more than me. You will need a lawyer who specializes in fraud. That night Clara sat at her kitchen table, the notebook, and Helena's files spread before her. The house around her was quiet, but she felt no loneliness. Instead, she felt something she had not felt in years: power. She was no longer the woman who had faded into the background of her own life. She was Clara Harland, the wife who had been erased, the mother who had been dismissed, the historian who knew how to uncover the past, and now she would be the woman who rewrote the ending. The candle on the table flickered as the night deepened. Clara gathered the papers into a neat stack, her resolve hardening with every movement. Tomorrow she would find the lawyer. Tomorrow the fight would begin in earnest. And Serena Vale, who had sat so confidently at Victor's funeral, would soon learn that the dead were not the only ones capable of leaving legacies. The weeks that followed were consumed with preparation. Clara's days became a cycle of documents, meetings, and sleepless nights, her mind fixed on the looming battle ahead. She had chosen her ally carefully. Michelle Rowan, a seasoned attorney with a reputation for exposing corporate fraud, agreed to take the case. Michelle was precise, unflinching, and carried herself with a quiet authority that reassured Clara from their very first meeting. Michelle examined the files Clara and Helena had gathered, her sharp eyes scanning each page with the ease of someone who had spent decades unraveling deceit. "This is more than infidelity," she said firmly. "This is systematic fraud. Serena Vale benefited from stolen funds, and that will does not protect her from the law. If we present this properly, we can not only invalidate her inheritance but force her to repay what she took." The words steadied Clara, but they also filled her with dread. She was about to step into a fight that would drag Victor's name through the courts, expose his empire as rotten, and pit her directly against Serena. Worse, Elias had made his position clear. He stood with Serena. The day of the hearing arrived with a chill wind sweeping through the city. Clara, dressed in a dark suit, simple but dignified, her veil left behind. She no longer needed to hide her face. As she entered the courthouse, its high stone steps rising before her, like the entrance to a fortress, whispers trailed behind. The story of the widow, the mistress, and the missing fortune had already spread. Reporters clustered near the doors, their cameras flashing their questions sharp and intrusive. Clara walked past them without a word, her spine straight, her eyes fixed on the future. Inside, the courtroom was vast and cold, its tall windows casting gray light across the polished floors. The benches were filled with onlookers, former colleagues of Victor's curious townspeople, and even members of the press. At the front sat the judge, a woman with silver hair pulled tightly back, her expression unreadable as she studied the papers before her. Serena entered moments later, her emerald dress replaced by a tailored suit the color of midnight. She moved with practiced grace, her chin lifted, her eyes scanning the room as if she already owned it. When her gaze met Clara's, she smiled faintly, a smile without warmth, polished and poisonous. Elias followed behind, his face pale, but his posture stiff with loyalty. He did not look at Clara. He took his place beside Serena, and the sight of it struck her harder than any words ever could. The proceedings began with Serena's lawyers. They spoke smoothly, presenting Serena as the devoted partner, the woman who had stood by Victor in his final years when his wife could not. They waived invoices and contracts, claiming the payments were legitimate compensation for consulting work Serena had provided. Their narrative was simple. Victor had chosen her, trusted her, and rewarded her accordingly. Clara listened in silence, her fists clenched beneath the table. She could feel the eyes of the crowd pressing down on her, their doubt heavy in the air. She knew how easy it was to dismiss a grieving widow as bitter, jealous, desperate to reclaim what she had lost. That was what Serena was counting on. When it was their turn, Michelle rose with calm authority. She spoke not with flourish, but with precision, laying out the facts like stones on a path. The shell companies. The dates of the transfers. The way each payment conveniently avoided official audits. She held up Helena's analysis, the patterns too exact to dismiss as coincidence. Then she called Clara to the stand. The room fell silent as Clara walked to the front, her heels clicking against the marble floor. She sat, her hands folded, her gaze steady on the judge. Michelle's questions guided her, but it was Clara's voice that carried the weight. She spoke of her 40 years of marriage, of the sacrifices she had made, of the silence she had endured. She described the nights she spent alone while Victor claimed to be working, the way Serena had appeared at company functions, always just within reach of her husband's gaze. She spoke of the letters, the photographs, the villa that had been Serena's all along. Her voice did not waver. She did not cry. She let the truth fall into the room like stones, into a still pond, each ripple reaching further than the last. When she spoke of selling her mother's heirloom to pay for Elias's tuition, she saw some of the jurors shift uncomfortably. When she spoke of finding the photograph marked, "Our Real Family," she saw the judge's eyes sharpen. Serena's lawyer tried to dismiss it all as the bitterness of a neglected wife. He held up the invoices again, insisting they were proof of legitimate work. But Michelle was ready. She produced records showing that the companies named on the invoices did not exist, that they were shells created only on paper. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs as the evidence stacked higher and higher against Serena. Finally, Michelle asked Clara one last question. "Mrs. Harland, why did you bring this case forward?" Clara lifted her chin, her voice clear. "Because I spent 40 years believing sacrifice was love. Because I gave everything I had to my husband, to my son, to a family I thought was real. And because I refused to let the truth be buried with Victor Harland. This is not about money. This is about dignity. And dignity is something I will no longer surrender." For a moment, silence filled the courtroom. Even Serena's smile faltered. The judge leaned forward, her expression unreadable, her gavel resting lightly in her hand. "I have heard enough for today," she said. "This court will reconvene tomorrow, at which time I will deliver my ruling." The crowd stirred as people rose, whispers filling the air. Serena swept from the room with her lawyers, her mask of confidence cracking only at the edges. Elias followed her, his eyes a storm of conflict, but he did not speak to Clara. Clara remained seated, her hands resting calmly in her lap. She knew the battle was not over, but for the first time she felt the weight of her silence lift. She had spoken. She had been heard, and tomorrow the judgment would fall. As she left the courtroom, the gray sky above seemed to part slightly, a thin blade of sunlight piercing through the clouds. Clara lifted her face to it and allowed herself a small breath of hope. Tomorrow, she thought, Serena Vale will learn that the past cannot be buried forever. The courthouse was restless the following morning. The benches filled quickly, the air charged with anticipation. Reporters leaned forward with pens, poised townsfolk whispered behind their hands, and even the clerk seemed to move with heightened purpose. Everyone knew this was not simply a widow's plea. It was the unraveling of Victor Harland's legacy and the possible ruin of the woman who had claimed to inherit it. Clara entered quietly, her steps measured. She wore the same dark suit, her hair neatly pulled back, her eyes steady. She did not glance at the crowd. She had no need for their approval. Her gaze was fixed on the front of the courtroom where the judge sat with her gavel, poised, ready to deliver the words that would decide everything. Serena Vale arrived moments later. She was immaculate, as always, draped in a silk blouse and a pearl necklace that gleamed under the lights. But her composure was not as flawless as the day before. Her smile was tight, her movements sharper, as though she were holding her mask together by sheer force of will. Elias followed her, pale and unspeaking, his eyes cast downward. The judge called the room to order. Her voice was calm, resonant, carrying across the hushed chamber. After reviewing the evidence, the testimony, and the financial records presented, this court has reached a decision. Clara's hands tightened around each other in her lap. Her breath caught, but she kept her face impassive, determined not to show weakness before Serena. The judge continued. The invoices presented by Miss Vale's counsel are fraudulent. The payments made from Victor Harland's companies to Miss Vale's accounts were not legitimate compensation for services rendered. They were unlawful transfers disguised to avoid detection. Furthermore, the will produced by Miss Vale, while appearing valid, is superseded by a codicil executed by Mr. Harland prior to his death, which this court has verified. A wave of murmurs swept the courtroom. Serena's head jerked up, her eyes flashing. Clara felt the room tilt, the air thicken. She had not known about a codicil. The thought sent a thrill through her chest. Even in his duplicity, Victor had left a fragment of truth buried, and now it surfaced against Serena. The judge struck her gavel once, silencing the crowd. Therefore, this court rules that the assets transferred to Miss Vale must be returned in full, including accumulated interest. The total sum amounts to over $1 million. Miss Vale is further ordered to relinquish the properties purchased with these funds. The estate of Victor Harland shall be restored in accordance with the codicil, and Miss Vale's claims are nullified. Gasps filled the room. Reporters scribbled furiously, flashes of light erupting from their cameras. Clara sat motionless, her heart pounding so loudly she could hear it in her ears. It was over. The woman who had smiled so triumphantly at Victor's funeral was stripped of everything in the span of a few sentences. Serena's face twisted with disbelief. She rose suddenly, her voice sharp, cutting through the murmurs. This is outrageous. Victor loved me. He promised me everything. This was his wish. The judge's gaze was stern. Promises whispered in shadows. Do not replace the law, Miss Vale. You will comply with this ruling. Serena's lawyers tried to calm her, but the mask had shattered. Her polished elegance crumbled, replaced by raw fury. She looked around the courtroom, her eyes landing on Clara, blazing with hatred. For a moment it seemed she might speak again, but no words came. Only silence, heavy and bitter. Clara met her gaze without flinching. She did not smile. She did not gloat. She simply sat calm and steady, knowing the truth had spoken for her. Elias stood beside Serena, his hands trembling at his sides. He did not look at Clara. His loyalty had placed him in Serena's shadow, and now he stood there as that shadow collapsed. Clara's heart ached for him, but she did not reach out. He would have to find his way back on his own. The judge dismissed the court. The sound of the gavel echoed like a final toll of a bell, closing one chapter and beginning another. People surged to their feet, voices rising, questions flying. Serena stormed from the room, her lawyers scrambling after her. Elias followed, his face pale, his shoulders rigid. Clara remained seated until the crowd thinned. She rose slowly, gathering her handbag, and walked out into the bright afternoon light. The sky was clear, washed clean by the previous day's storm. For the first time in years, Clara felt the air in her lungs without heaviness. On the courthouse steps, a reporter rushed toward her, microphone in hand. "Mrs. Harland, do you have anything to say about today's decision?" Clara paused. The crowd leaned in, waiting for her words. She looked at the journalist, then at the sea beyond the rooftops. Her voice was calm, firm. "I came here for the truth," she said, "and the truth has spoken." She walked past the flashing cameras, her steps steady, her face composed. Behind her, Serena's name was already being whispered with disdain, her reputation unraveling as quickly as her fortune. The woman who had tried to erase Clara had been erased herself, not by vengeance but by justice. Yet Clara knew this was not the end. The money, the properties, the victory in court, none of it restored what she had lost. Victor was still gone. Elias was still a stranger to her. The years she had given, the sacrifices she had made, could not be reclaimed. But as she stood at the edge of the courthouse steps, the sunlight warming her face, Clara realized something had shifted. She was no longer invisible, no longer silenced. The world had seen her, heard her, and acknowledged her strength. And Serena Vale, the woman who had once seemed untouchable, was nothing more than a fallen pretender stripped bare before the truth. Clara lifted her chin, the faintest trace of a smile touching her lips. The fight had cost her dearly, but it had also given her back something Victor had stolen long ago: herself. The courthouse victory should have felt like an ending, but for Clara it was only another beginning. The world now knew Serena Vale for what she truly was, and the wealth she had stolen was stripped away. Yet when Clara returned to the Harland estate, silence met her at the door. The echo of her footsteps followed her through the halls, and the emptiness of the house reminded her of what even justice could not return. Elias did not come. In the weeks that followed, she wrote him letters carefully worded, filled with honesty rather than anger. She told him of his childhood, of the nights she stayed awake when he struggled to breathe, of the afternoons she waited outside his school just to make sure the bullies left him alone. She wrote of the sacrifices she had made gladly, never expecting anything in return. And she told him the truth that his father had deceived not only her but him as well. No reply came. Months turned into years. Clara's hair grew silver at the temples, her face lined with time, but her strength did not waver. She kept the estate alive, though it no longer felt like a home. She tended the gardens, restored the vineyards, and filled her days with quiet work. At night, she still felt the weight of absence, the hollow spaces left behind by Victor's betrayal and Elias's silence. But grief does not stay sharp forever. Slowly it dulled into something she could carry. Clara had learned to live with loss, and she began to find moments of peace walking barefoot across the dew-covered lawn in the early mornings, watching the sun rise over the cliffs, listening to the sea's steady rhythm. Then one day the telephone rang. She almost ignored it. The sound startled her sharp against the calm of the house. She lifted the receiver, slowly bracing herself. On the other end was a voice she had not heard in years, Mother Elias said. His voice was softer than she remembered, heavy with something that sounded almost like regret. Clara closed her eyes, her hand tightening on the receiver. "Elias, I heard about grandfather," he said quietly. "I thought I should call." Her father had died only a week earlier, and the grief had been fresh, raw, but muted compared to what she had endured with Victor. She had not expected Elias to reach out. They met at the funeral in a small countryside chapel. Clara stood at the front, her father's simple coffin before her, when she felt a presence beside her. Elias. He looked older, more worn, as though the years had not been kind to him. His eyes held shadows, but when he looked at her, there was no longer coldness. There was uncertainty. After the service, they stood together in the garden. The crab-apple tree Clara had planted 20 years earlier was in bloom, its branches heavy with pale blossoms. She touched one of the branches, remembering how close she had come to cutting it down when she thought it was dead. "Last year it nearly withered completely," she said softly, "but this spring it bloomed earlier than ever. Life is stubborn, Elias. It clings to whatever hope it can find." He looked at her, his lips pressed tight. "I was wrong," he admitted at last. His voice cracked on the words. "I defended father, defended Serena. I thought they gave me a family, but all they gave me were lies. I should have believed you." Clara's heart ached, but she reached out, touching his hand lightly. "You were blinded, Elias. So was I for far too long. What matters is that you see clearly now." Tears welled in his eyes, and for the first time since he was a boy, he embraced her. She felt the strength of his arms, the tremor in his shoulders, and she held him as she once had when he was small and afraid of the dark. "I am sorry," he whispered. "I know," she said, "and I never stopped believing you would come back." They stood together beneath the blooming tree, its petals falling around them like fragments of snow. For Clara, it was not the restoration of everything she had lost, but it was enough. The bond between them, frayed and battered, was not broken. It had survived, scarred but alive. In the weeks that followed, Elias visited often. They spoke of the past, of the mistakes made, of the illusions they had clung to. Slowly they began to mend what had been torn apart. Clara knew it would never be perfect. There would always be shadows lingering, but there was also light, and that was enough. One evening, as they sat together in the garden, Elias asked her, "How did you find the strength, Mother, after everything Father did after I turned away from you? How did you keep going?" Clara looked out at the sea, the waves catching the last of the evening Sunday. "Because I learned something, Elias. Sacrifice is not love if it erases you. I gave too much of myself away. But when everything was taken from me, I discovered what was left, and what was left was strength." He nodded, his gaze steady. For the first time in years, she felt he truly understood. Later that night, when the house grew quiet again, Clara walked barefoot through the garden. The wind carried the scent of blossoms, and the chimes on the porch tinkled softly in the breeze. She paused at the edge of the lawn, looking at the sky where the stars began to appear, and felt an unfamiliar peace. She had been betrayed, broken, erased. But she had risen, fought, and endured. She had uncovered the truth, reclaimed her dignity, and begun to rebuild the bond with her son. The past would always linger, but it no longer defined her. Clara Harland knew at last who she was. Not a shadow, not a sacrifice, but a survivor. The days after Elias's return settled into a gentler rhythm. For the first time in years, Clara felt the heavy silence of the Harland estate change. It was no longer a silence of abandonment, but one of healing. Elias would visit on weekends, sometimes staying for dinner, other times walking with her through the vineyard paths. Their conversations were no longer strained with bitterness. They spoke quietly, sometimes of the past, sometimes of the present, and occasionally of the future that still lay open before them. One evening, Clara found herself standing alone in the garden. The crabapple tree, once thought nearly dead, was in full bloom. Its branches bent beneath the weight of blossoms, pale petals drifting down in the breeze. She reached out and touched the rough bark, remembering the day she almost had it cut down. She smiled faintly, realizing how much it mirrored her own life. She had been close to surrender once. The betrayal had nearly broken her, the loss of her husband and her son had hollowed her to the core. But like the tree she had endured, she had held on through storms, and now she stood renewed. Stronger, rooted not in illusions but in truth. The house, once a monument to Victor's dominance, felt different now. She had changed the study, moving Victor's heavy desk to the corner and replacing it with a smaller oak table of her own. She filled the shelves not with his ledgers but with books she loved, histories and novels she had neglected for decades. The dining room no longer carried the weight of his authority. She sat at the head of the table, now not as his shadow but as herself. Elias noticed the changes. One evening as he stood in the study doorway, he smiled softly. "It feels like you're home now, Mother," he said. Clara nodded. "It always should have been. I see that clearly now." She had also begun to reclaim parts of herself that had been buried long before. She returned to her old work, not as a career but as a passion. She spent afternoons at the library poring over archives, writing essays, and reconnecting with the historian she once was. Her words found their way into local journals, and for the first time in years her name appeared in print, not as an appendage to Victor Harland's empire, but as Clara Harland, writer and historian. The transformation was quiet but profound. She no longer defined herself by what she had given away, but by what she had reclaimed. Her life was not over. It was beginning anew with her own voice at its center. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in shades of rose and gold, Clara walked barefoot across the garden. The grass was cool beneath her feet, the wind gentle against her face. She stopped at the edge of the lawn and looked toward the horizon where the sea stretched endlessly, its waves catching the fading light. Victor was gone. Serena had been stripped of her illusions. Elias had returned, though the years of distance left scars that would never fully fade. Yet Clara no longer sought perfection. She no longer clung to the need for everything to be whole. What remained was enough. She turned her gaze back to the house, the porch light glowing softly, the wind chimes tinkling in the evening breeze. She felt a calm certainty settle over her. She knew who she was now, not a discarded wife, not a forgotten mother, not a shadow behind another person's story. She was a survivor, she was a fighter, and she was free. Clara took one last step toward the horizon, then turned back inside her heart lighter than it had been in decades. The story of Victor Harland had ended, but hers was only beginning. Clara's journey reminds us that betrayal, loss, and heartbreak do not define the end of a life. They can become the very ground on which new strength grows. Sacrifices made in silence do not go unnoticed forever, and truth, no matter how deeply buried, always finds its way to the surface. In the end, dignity comes not from what others give us, but from what we claim for ourselves. If you found Clara's story moving, make sure to like this video, share it with others who love powerful stories, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe to the channel for more tales filled with betrayal, resilience, and redemption. Your support helps us bring you more stories that inspire and captivate.